Ladies and gentlemen, if you are enjoying my videos, please click the like button. It is the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. On a scorching summer day, Ruslan sat at the dusty, worn-out train station, idly shelling sunflower seeds between his fingers. Each crack of the seed was a small, sharp sound against the backdrop of the station's drowsy hum. Pigeons pecked and strutted nearby, their gray feathers shimmering with the heat of the sun. Ruslan's gaze followed their erratic movements as he tried to distract himself from the gnawing anxiety in his stomach. The heat pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. Sweat trickled down his back, and the dry, hot air made every breath feel like an effort. The station was nearly deserted, with only a few other travelers scattered on the benches, each lost in their own world of waiting. The distant sound of a train horn occasionally broke the monotony, but otherwise, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Ruslan's mind wandered as he watched the pigeons. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell about how pigeons could carry messages from the dead. A shiver ran down his spine despite the heat. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the eerie thoughts. This was just another hot day in a sleepy town, and he was just waiting for a bus to take him to the village where he hoped to find some answers about his missing sister, Christina. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Ruslan glanced at the clock above the ticket booth. Still an hour to go. He sighed and shifted on the hard bench, his fingers absent-mindedly reaching for another seed. As he popped it into his mouth, a strange feeling washed over him, like he was being watched. He looked around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just the same old station, the same old pigeons, and the same oppressive heat. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something unusual. 3 small birds, not pigeons but sparrows, sat on the fence near the edge of the platform. Their feathers were as black as coal, contrasting starkly with the dusty surroundings. They sat unnaturally still, their beady eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. These weren't ordinary sparrows. There was something almost menacing in the way they stared, as if they knew something he didn't. Ruslan tried to ignore them, but the feeling of unease only grew. The sparrows remained motionless, their gaze unwavering. A chill ran through him, a cold dread that cut through the heat. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to look away, but the image of those black sparrows was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were a bad omen, a harbinger of something terrible. As the bus finally pulled into the station, Ruslan gathered his things, trying to push aside the creeping sense of foreboding. He took one last look at the sparrows before boarding. They were still there, still watching. He couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something dark, something that would lead him down a path filled with shadows and secrets better left untouched. Suddenly, Ruslan's eyes caught sight of something unusual. Perched on the rusty iron fence at the edge of the platform were 3 black sparrows. They stood out starkly against the backdrop of sun-bleached wood and dusty concrete. These birds were not the typical brown and gray sparrows he was accustomed to. Their feathers were a deep, glossy black, absorbing the harsh sunlight and giving them an almost unnatural sheen. What struck Ruslan the most was their eyes. They were tiny, dark beads, yet they seemed to bore into him with a piercing intensity. Unlike the other birds at the station, these sparrows didn't flit about restlessly or peck at crumbs. They remained eerily still, their gaze locked onto Ruslan, as if they were observing, analyzing, and judging him. A shiver ran down Ruslan's spine. He tried to dismiss the growing unease, telling himself that they were just birds. But the longer he looked at them, the more convinced he became that there was something sinister about their presence. It felt as if they were sentinels, harbingers of some unseen force that had taken an interest in him. He glanced around, hoping to see if anyone else had noticed the strange birds, but the other travelers were absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the unnerving spectacle. The pigeons continued their indifferent pecking, and the old clock above the ticket booth ticked away the slow minutes. Ruslan's mind raced. He had heard stories of black birds being omens of bad luck, messengers of death or misfortune. His grandmother used to whisper such tales to him when he was a child, her voice low and serious, as if sharing forbidden knowledge. He had always dismissed them as superstitions, remnants of an older, more fearful time. But now, confronted with the unsettling stillness of the black sparrows, he felt a creeping doubt. The birds remained motionless, their eyes never leaving him. Ruslan felt a sudden urge to leave the station, to escape the oppressive heat and the unsettling presence of those unblinking eyes. But he was waiting for the bus, and he couldn't afford to miss it. His search for Christina depended on it. Trying to shake off his fear, he shifted on the bench and focused on the mundane details of his surroundings. The cracked tiles of the platform, the faded advertisements peeling off the walls, the distant hum of a train approaching. Anything to distract himself from the relentless gaze of the sparrows. But it was no use. The unease clung to him like a second skin, prickling and uncomfortable. He risked another glance at the fence. The sparrows hadn't moved. They seemed almost like statues, their stillness unnatural and unnerving. Ruslan's heart pounded in his chest. He clenched his fists, the sunflower seeds crunching in his grip. Just then, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the station. The bus was finally arriving. Ruslan stood up, his movements hurried and anxious. He grabbed his bag and made his way to the edge of the platform, casting one last, nervous glance at the fence. The sparrows were still there, watching him with their dark, inscrutable eyes. Ruslan boarded the bus, his mind a swirl of fear and confusion. As the vehicle pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that those black sparrows were more than just birds. They were a sign, a warning of the darkness that lay ahead in his search for Christina. As the bus rumbled down the dusty road, Ruslan's thoughts turned to his sister, Christina. It had been weeks since she vanished without a trace, leaving behind a void filled with worry and fear. Ruslan could still picture her vibrant smile, her laughter echoing in his memories. The police had been of little help, their efforts dwindling as the days passed with no leads. Desperation gnawed at him, driving him to take matters into his own hands. Ruslan pulled out his phone and opened Instagram, scrolling through Christina's feed. Her last post was a selfie, radiant and carefree, taken just a few days before she disappeared. He stared at the photo, searching for clues in her eyes, her expression, the background. There was nothing unusual, just the image of a young woman full of life. He had spent countless hours poring over her social media, looking for any hint of where she might have gone or who she might have been with. Every photo, every comment, every tagged location was a potential lead. He had messaged her friends, even those she barely knew, hoping someone might have seen or heard something that could help. The responses had been dishearteningly similar: sympathy, concern, but no useful information. Ruslan had also taken to the streets, showing her photo to strangers, visiting places she used to frequent. He felt like he was chasing shadows, each lead turning into a dead end. The city, once familiar and bustling, now seemed vast and indifferent, its crowded streets and busy squares offering no answers. One night, in a fit of frustration, he had gone through Christina's belongings, hoping to find something the police might have missed. Hidden in a drawer, he found a small, old-fashioned locket. Inside was a picture of them as children, a reminder of simpler times. He clutched it tightly, vowing not to rest until he found her. His investigation led him to a series of photos Christina had posted of a small village, far from the city's noise and chaos. She had mentioned wanting to escape the hustle, to find some peace. Ruslan had never paid much attention at the time, but now it seemed like a possible lead. He had mapped out the route, packed a bag, and set off, determined to uncover the truth. As the bus rattled on, Ruslan revisited the photos of the village. The quaint houses, the dense woods surrounding them, the narrow paths that seemed to lead into the unknown. Something about those images unsettled him. There was an eerie stillness, a sense of isolation that now felt more threatening than peaceful. He scrolled further, finding a series of comments on one of the village photos. Most were innocent enough, but one stood out. It was from a user he didn't recognize, their profile private, with only a single posted dark, blurry image that gave him chills. The comment was cryptic, just a few words: "Come find me." Ruslan had tried to trace the account, but it led nowhere. The username was a jumble of letters and numbers, and the account had been created just days before Christina went missing. The memory of that comment haunted him. It felt like a taunt, a sinister invitation. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind it knew something about Christina's disappearance. The village seemed to be his only clue, the only thread he had left to follow. Ruslan looked out the window as the landscape changed, the city's concrete jungle giving way to rolling fields and thickening forests. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road. He felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of dread and determination. He didn't know what awaited him in the village, but he knew he had to find out. He closed Instagram and slipped his phone back into his pocket, his mind racing with possibilities. The bus trundled on, carrying him closer to the unknown, to the mystery that had swallowed his sister. Ruslan took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. He had to find Christina, no matter the cost. Ruslan's resolve hardened as the bus carried him deeper into the countryside. The cityscape had long since faded into a mosaic of fields and forests, the horizon a blur of green and gold under the summer sun. Each passing mile felt like a step further into the unknown, a journey away from the familiar safety of urban life and into the heart of a mystery that threatened to consume him. He clutched his backpack tightly, the worn fabric a comforting reminder of his purpose. Inside were the essentials: a flashlight, a map, some food, and a few photographs of Christina. Her smile in those pictures was a beacon, urging him forward despite the gnawing fear that something terrible had happened to her. The bus jolted along the uneven road, its engine growling in protest at the rough terrain. Ruslan glanced at the other passengers. They were few and far between, mostly older villagers who seemed to belong to a different world. Their faces were etched with the lines of a hard life, their eyes reflecting the stoic acceptance of rural existence. He wondered if any of them knew the secrets the village held, if they had seen his sister or heard her laughter in the wind. As the bus neared its destination, Ruslan's anxiety grew. The landscape became more rugged, the trees denser and more oppressive. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, a far cry from the polluted tang of the city. He found himself missing the noise and bustle of urban life, the sense of security it provided. Here, everything felt raw and exposed, as if the village itself was watching him, judging his intentions. The bus finally came to a halt at a small, dilapidated station. The driver, a grizzled man with a permanent scowl, announced the stop with a bored tone. Ruslan gathered his things and stepped off the bus, his feet crunching on the gravel path. The station was little more than a shack, its wooden planks weathered and splintering. An old sign creaked in the breeze, its faded letters barely legible: "Welcome to Zaravo." Ruslan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. The village sprawled out before him, a collection of humble homes and winding paths that disappeared into the forest. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him, the villagers' curious and suspicious glances from behind curtained windows. He knew he had to tread carefully. Outsiders were rarely welcomed with open arms in such remote places. He pulled out his map and checked his bearings. Christina had mentioned a guest house in one of her posts, a place she had planned to stay. It was his first destination, the starting point of his search. He adjusted his backpack and set off down the main road, the gravel crunching underfoot with each determined step. As he walked, the sense of unease grew stronger. The village seemed frozen in time, its atmosphere thick with an oppressive silence. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cawing of crows. Ruslan's instincts told him that something was wrong, that this place harbored dark secrets. He passed by the village square, where a few children played under the watchful eyes of their parents. The adults' conversations hushed as he approached, their gazes following him with thinly veiled suspicion. Ruslan offered a polite nod, but they remained silent, their expressions wary and closed off. The guest house was a modest building on the outskirts of the village, its facade worn but welcoming. A sign hanging above the door read "Pension Zaravo" in faded letters. Ruslan pushed the door open and stepped inside, the creak of the hinges announcing his arrival. An elderly woman with kind eyes and a weathered face stood behind the counter. She greeted him with a warm, albeit cautious smile. Ruslan introduced himself and explained that he was looking for his sister. The woman's expression softened with sympathy as she listened. "She stayed here for a few nights," the woman said, her voice tinged with concern. "She seemed troubled, but she didn't share much. One day she just left early in the morning, without a word. We haven't seen her since." Ruslan's heart sank. He had hoped for more concrete information, a clear direction. The woman offered to show him Christina's room in case it held any clues. He followed her up the narrow stairs to a small, tidy room. The bed was made, the window open to let in the summer breeze. It was as if Christina had never been there, her presence reduced to a faint memory. Ruslan searched the room, his fingers brushing over the simple furnishings. He found nothing out of the ordinary, no hidden messages or forgotten belongings. Frustration gnawed at him, but he couldn't afford to lose hope. He thanked the woman and left the guest house, his mind racing with possibilities. Outside, the village seemed even more menacing. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower, casting eerie shapes across the ground. Ruslan decided to explore further, to talk to the villagers and see if anyone had seen Christina after she left the guest house. He felt the weight of the village's secrets pressing down on him, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Christina was out there somewhere, and he was her only hope. As Ruslan delved deeper into the village, a sense of unease clung to him like a second skin. The tranquility of Zarvo felt forced, an eerie stillness that masked hidden tensions. The air seemed thicker here, charged with an unspoken dread that made each breath a labor. He couldn't shake the memory of the black sparrows. Their piercing gazes had felt almost human, as if they were trying to communicate something beyond his understanding. Their presence had been unsettling, an omen of sorts, casting a dark shadow over his thoughts. Ruslan approached the village square again, where a few more villagers had gathered. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward him and then away, as if they feared drawing too much attention. He approached a middle-aged man who was repairing a fence, hoping for some friendly guidance. "Excuse me," Ruslan began, trying to sound casual despite the tension knotting his stomach. "I'm looking for my sister. She was here a few days ago. Have you seen her?" The man glanced up, his face a mask of indifference. He shook his head and mumbled something unintelligible before turning back to his work. Ruslan's frustration grew. It was as if the whole village had conspired to keep him in the dark. He continued his search, each encounter with the villagers yielding the same cold response. There was a collective reluctance to engage with him, a wall of silence that seemed impenetrable. It was clear they knew something, but fear or loyalty kept them from speaking out. As evening approached, Ruslan decided to visit the local bar. It was a modest establishment, its wooden sign creaking in the breeze. Inside, the dim lighting and low murmur of conversation created a somber atmosphere. He took a seat at the bar and ordered a drink, hoping the alcohol would loosen some tongues. The bartender, a burly man with a graying beard, served him a glass of vodka. Ruslan sipped it slowly, watching the other patrons. They were an eclectic mix of villagers, their faces worn by years of hard work and harsh weather. He caught snippets of conversations, but none seemed relevant to his search. After a while, the bartender approached him. "You're not from around here," he said, his tone more curious than accusatory. Ruslan nodded. "I'm looking for my sister. She was here recently, stayed at the guest house, but then disappeared." The bartender's eyes narrowed slightly. "We don't get many visitors. If she left, she probably had a good reason. Maybe she didn't want to be found." Ruslan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean by that?" The bartender shrugged. "People come and go. Sometimes they don't want to be followed. This village has its share of secrets, like any other. Best not to dig too deep." Ruslan's grip tightened on his glass. "I can't leave without finding her. If there's anything you know, please tell me." The bartender studied him for a moment, then leaned in closer. "There's talk of strange things happening in the woods. Old stories, rumors. If you're determined to find her, you might want to start there. But be careful. The forest doesn't give up its secrets easily." With that cryptic advice, the bartender moved away, leaving Ruslan with more questions than answers. He finished his drink and left the bar, the oppressive night air wrapping around him like a shroud. The village seemed even more foreboding in the darkness, its secrets pressing in on him from all sides. Determined, Ruslan headed toward the edge of the village, where the forest loomed like a dark sentinel. He knew the answers he sought were hidden somewhere within its depths. As he approached the tree line, the sensation of being watched returned, more intense than before. He glanced back at the village one last time, then stepped into the shadows of the forest, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. Ruslan paced back and forth in his small room at the village guest house, anxiety gnawing at him. Spread out on the bed were the contents of his sister's backpack, a few changes of clothes, a worn notebook, some cosmetics, and a small leather pouch that had caught his eye immediately. He had found the backpack hidden under a pile of old blankets in the guest house attic, a place where it seemed no one had ventured in years. With trembling hands, Ruslan opened the leather pouch again. Inside were several items that made his blood run cold: a small vial of an unknown liquid, a folded piece of parchment with strange symbols scrawled on it, and a handful of photographs. The photographs showed his sister, Christina, in various places around the village, but one in particular stood out. It was a picture of her standing in front of a decrepit wooden shack deep in the forest. Her expression was one of fear and determination, as if she knew the significance of the place but was compelled to go there anyway. Ruslan's heart pounded as he tried to piece together what this could mean. He knew he couldn't go to the police with this. The local authorities in such a small village were likely to be suspicious of outsiders, and he had no idea how deep the village's secrets ran. More importantly, the items in Christina's pouch could be interpreted in many ways, some of which could implicate her in something dark and sinister. He couldn't shake the feeling that the village harbored more than just unfriendly locals. There was a palpable sense of something ancient and malevolent lurking just beneath the surface, something that had ensnared his sister. Ruslan was determined to uncover the truth, but he had to be careful. He had to move in the shadows, just as the dark forces seemed to do. Ruslan carefully repacked the items, taking a moment to memorize the symbols on the parchment before folding it back into the pouch. He tucked the pouch into his jacket pocket, making sure it was well concealed. If anyone saw him with it, they might start asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. He knew the police were only a phone call away, but involving them could mean endangering Christina even further or alerting those who might want to keep her disappearance a secret. He decided to retrace Christina's steps, starting with the places in the photographs. He left the guest house under the cover of night, avoiding the main roads and keeping to the shadows. The village, though small, had a labyrinthine quality in the dark, with narrow alleys and twisting paths that seemed to lead nowhere. Every creak of the wooden houses, every distant murmur of conversation, set his nerves on edge. As he approached the edge of the forest, the darkness seemed to deepen, the trees forming a nearly impenetrable wall. The path ahead was barely visible, illuminated only by the weak light of the crescent moon. Ruslan hesitated, his breath fogging in the cool night air. He was venturing into unknown territory, driven by a mix of fear and hope. He couldn't help but think of the black sparrows, their watchful eyes a reminder that he was not alone in his search. Taking a deep breath, Ruslan plunged into the forest, the dense canopy swallowing him in darkness. The path was narrow and overgrown, branches clawing at his clothes as he pushed forward. His mind raced with thoughts of Christina, wondering what she had discovered and why she had ventured so deep into the woods. The photograph of the shack loomed large in his mind, a beacon guiding him through the blackness. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, made him flinch, but he pressed on, driven by a fierce determination. He knew that uncovering the truth would be dangerous, but it was a risk he was willing to take. He had to find his sister and bring her back, no matter what dark secrets the village was hiding. As the forest closed in around him, Ruslan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, watching his every move. He quickened his pace, his senses heightened, ready for whatever lay ahead. The night was far from over, and he knew that his journey into the heart of darkness had only just begun. Despite the fear that gnawed at him and the pervasive sense of confusion, Ruslan resolved to press on with his investigation. He knew that the answers to his questions were hidden somewhere in the dense, foreboding taiga and the isolated villages that dotted the landscape. The village where he stayed was just the beginning, a mere gateway into a deeper mystery that lay shrouded in the shadows of the ancient forest. The morning sun filtered weakly through the trees as Ruslan gathered his belongings and set out. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves, but beneath the natural beauty lay an undercurrent of something ominous. He walked with a determined stride, clutching the leather pouch with Christina's belongings tightly in his jacket pocket. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and theories, each one darker and more sinister than the last. The path he followed was barely more than a trail, often disappearing under a carpet of fallen leaves and tangled roots. He had studied the photographs meticulously, noting landmarks and details that might guide him. Each step he took seemed to echo in the stillness, a constant reminder of his isolation. Yet he felt an invisible thread pulling him forward, a connection to his sister that he could not explain but which he trusted implicitly. As he ventured deeper into the taiga, the trees grew taller and more oppressive, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air grew cooler and carried a damp, earthy scent. He stumbled upon a clearing where the remains of an old campfire suggested recent human activity. Ruslan knelt down, examining the charred wood and the faint traces of footprints around it. Someone had been here, perhaps not long ago. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but it also spurred him on. He continued his journey, moving from one village to the next. Each settlement was more remote than the last, with fewer people and more superstitions. The villagers were wary, their eyes tracking his every move with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Ruslan asked questions, showing Christina's photograph to anyone who would listen, but the responses were always the same: blank stares, shrugged shoulders, and whispered conversations behind his back. One evening, as he sat by a small fire in yet another desolate village, an old man approached him. His face was weathered and lined, his eyes sharp and penetrating. Without a word, the old man sat down beside Ruslan and stared into the flames. After a long silence, he spoke in a voice as rough as gravel, telling Ruslan of a place deep in the forest where few dared to go. It was a place of dark legends, where spirits were said to roam and ancient secrets lay buried. The old man mentioned a name that sent a chill through Ruslan: the Whispering Pines. According to the old man, the Whispering Pines was a grove deep within the taiga, surrounded by tales of disappearances and strange occurrences. The locals avoided it, believing it to be cursed. Ruslan felt a surge of determination mixed with dread. He thanked the old man, who simply nodded and vanished back into the shadows from which he had come. The next morning, Ruslan set out for the Whispering Pines. The journey was arduous, the terrain becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing denser and the light dimmer. As he neared the grove, an eerie silence fell over the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife were conspicuously absent, replaced by a hushed, almost palpable tension. When Ruslan finally reached the Whispering Pines, he was struck by the unnatural stillness of the place. The trees here were different, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun completely. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something acrid and metallic. He walked slowly, every sense alert, feeling as if he were being watched. In the center of the grove, he found a small clearing. At its heart stood an old, weathered stone altar, covered in moss and lichen. The sight of it filled him with a sense of foreboding, but he forced himself to approach. As he examined the altar, he noticed symbols carved into the stone, similar to those on the parchment in Christina's pouch. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Ruslan knelt by the altar, tracing the symbols with his fingers. A sudden gust of wind swept through the grove, rustling the branches and whispering through the trees. He felt a presence, an unseen force that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. In that moment, he knew he had found the heart of the mystery, the place where all the threads converged. He steeled himself, ready to face whatever dark truths lay hidden in the shadows, determined to find his sister and bring her home. That night, as Ruslan lay in the small, dimly lit room of the village's only inn, exhaustion overtook him. The weight of the day's journey and the oppressive atmosphere of the Whispering Pines bore down on him, and despite his determination, he soon fell into a restless sleep. In his dream, he found himself standing in front of an old, decrepit barn. The wooden structure was weather-beaten, its planks warped and splintered, and the air around it was thick with a sense of foreboding. The moon cast an eerie glow, illuminating the barn with a ghostly light. Ruslan's heart pounded as he stepped forward, the creaking of the barn door echoing ominously in the stillness of the night. Inside, the barn was filled with shadows, and the air was thick with the smell of hay and decay. He heard a faint, desperate whisper calling his name. "Ruslan, please help me." The voice was unmistakably his sister's, filled with fear and urgency. He followed the sound, his footsteps echoing on the dirt floor as he navigated through the dark, narrow passageways between stacks of hay bales. He found Christina huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. She was dressed in the same clothes she had worn the day she disappeared, now torn and dirty. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and she trembled as she looked up at him. "Ruslan, you have to hide me. Don't let them find me," she pleaded, her voice breaking with emotion. Ruslan's heart ached at the sight of his sister in such a state. He reached out to her, but as his fingers brushed against her arm, she recoiled, shaking her head frantically. "No, you don't understand. They are coming for me. You have to leave, now." Confused and frightened, Ruslan tried to reassure her. "Christina, who is coming? What are you talking about?" But before she could answer, the barn was filled with a cacophony of whispers, sinister and unintelligible. The shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them, and the temperature dropped abruptly. Christina's eyes darted around the barn, her fear intensifying. "You have to go. They will find you too. Please just go." Her voice was a frantic whisper, and she pushed him away with a surprising strength. Ruslan felt a cold hand grip his heart. The shadows grew thicker, more oppressive, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. He backed away, his eyes locked on Christina's terrified face. "I'll come back for you, I promise." He shouted over the noise, but his words seemed to vanish into the void. As he stumbled out of the barn, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the ground. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Ruslan woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The room was dark, and the only sound was his own ragged breathing. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a nightmare. He sat up, running a hand through his damp hair, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The image of Christina, scared and desperate, was burned into his mind. He knew he couldn't ignore it. The dream was a sign, a message from his subconscious, urging him to find her before it was too late. Determined to unravel the mystery and save his sister, Ruslan got out of bed and prepared himself for the day ahead. The whispering pines and the dark secrets they harbored awaited him, and he was ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead to bring Christina back home. In the depths of his unsettling dream, Ruslan's eyes were drawn to an unusual sight amidst the dim, eerie surroundings of the barn. Perched on a beam above, nearly shrouded in darkness, was a small bird that seemed out of place. Its black feathers gleamed faintly in the moonlight that seeped through the cracks in the barn's wooden walls. As Ruslan squinted, trying to make sense of it, the bird shifted slightly, revealing a single stark white feather among its midnight plumage. This peculiar detail triggered a wave of uneasy recognition in Ruslan's mind. He remembered seeing such a bird before in his dreams. The black sparrow with the solitary white feather had always been a harbinger of something ominous, a symbol he could never quite understand, but knew to be significant. The sight of it now, in the midst of his sister's desperate pleas and the barn's foreboding atmosphere, filled him with a deep, gnawing dread. The bird's eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence, and as Ruslan stared at it, a shiver ran down his spine. It was as if the bird was watching him, judging him, and waiting for something. The sensation of being observed, not just by the bird but by an unseen presence, grew stronger, amplifying the oppressive feeling of dread. Christina's whispered words echoed in his mind, mingling with the rustling sound of the bird's feathers. "They are coming for me." The sparrow seemed to be a part of that ominous, a sentinel of the dark forces that sought to claim his sister. Ruslan felt a surge of protective anger and fear. He had to decipher the meaning behind these dreams, the significance of the bird, and the truth of what was happening to Christina. As the barn door slammed shut behind him in the dream, he found himself back in the waking world, jolted upright in his bed. The room was silent, but his heart continued to race. The image of the black sparrow with the white feather lingered in his mind, a chilling reminder of the nightmarish encounter. Ruslan sat up, trying to shake off the residual fear. The bird was more than just a figment of his imagination. It was a clue, a piece of the puzzle he needed to solve. The previous dream had been dismissed as a mere nightmare, But now he understood it held a deeper meaning, a warning he could no longer ignore. Determined to uncover the truth, Ruslan knew he had to continue his investigation with renewed vigor. The dreams were guiding him, pointing him towards something hidden in the depths of the forest and the mysterious village. The sparrow, with its enigmatic presence, was a key to understanding the darkness that had taken his sister. As he prepared to face another day of searching, the memory of the bird and its unsettling gaze spurred him on. He would not rest until he had unraveled the mystery and found Christina, no matter what sinister secrets awaited him in the shadows. Christina, hiding in the barn, felt the weight of fear pressing down on her chest. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the roof cast eerie shadows across the old beams and piles of debris, covered in a thick layer of dust. The barn was dark and foreboding, as if it held 1,000 untold stories of suffering and despair. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could be heard by anyone nearby. She knew she was being hunted, and this barn was her only chance for refuge. Christina looked around, desperately searching for a safe spot, but everything around her seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Dirt and blood smeared her clothes and skin. She could feel the sticky warmth of the blood on her fingers, a grim reminder of the recent horrors she had endured. The marks on her body were proof of the nightmare she was living. Her hands trembled as she tried to wipe the blood from her face, but this only made things worse, smearing it further and deepening her sense of panic. Outside the barn, she could hear rustling. Someone or something was moving through the dense underbrush, drawing closer to her hiding place. Christina clamped her hands over her mouth, stifling her sobs. She knew that even the smallest sound could betray her location. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open. Her heart froze. She shrank back into the shadows, trying to make herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see only fleeting shadows, but it was enough to tell her that danger was near. She thought of Ruslan and their childhood games of hide and seek, but now there was no joy in hiding, only the cold grip of fear. Every movement was a struggle. Her legs felt weak, as if the ground was shifting beneath her. Memories of happier times floated through her mind, seeming distant and unreal in the face of her current terror. Fear clouded her thoughts, making it hard to think clearly. Christina tried to inch her way towards another corner of the barn, where an old cart stood. It might offer some cover, a temporary sanctuary. But each step was an ordeal, as if some unseen force was holding her back. At one point, she felt a sharp pain in her leg and realized she had stepped on something sharp, but she ignored it, continuing her crawl towards the cart. Finally, reaching the cart, Christina curled up behind it, hoping it would shield her from sight. But deep down, she knew that in this cursed barn, safety was just an illusion. She closed her eyes and began to pray, hoping for a miracle that would pull her out of this nightmare. Ruslan felt a crushing sense of helplessness wash over him as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment. The air was thick with the weight of despair, and the walls seemed to close in on him. His mind was a chaotic swirl of worry and frustration, haunted by images of his sister, Christina, lost and in danger. He had scoured the city, leaving no stone unturned in his search for her. He had questioned friends, visited her favorite haunts, and combed through her social media profiles, hoping to find a clue that might lead him to her. But every lead had turned into a dead end. Every hope had been dashed. The police had been little help, treating her disappearance as just another case in a city full of missing persons. Ruslan's heart ached with the thought of Christina out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly worse. He pictured her face, her bright eyes filled with fear, her voice calling out for him. He clenched his fists in frustration, feeling the sting of tears welling up in his eyes. How could he have let this happen? He had always promised to protect her, but now she was gone, and he was powerless to bring her back. The sense of failure gnawed at him, an ever-present reminder of his inability to save his sister. He replayed their last conversation in his mind, searching for any hint, any clue he might have missed. But there was nothing, just a normal chat between siblings that gave no indication of the horror to come. His apartment was filled with the remnants of his frantic search maps with circled locations, printouts of messages, and photos of Christina. Ruslan stared at one of the photos, taken just a few months ago. Christina was smiling, full of life and happiness. Now that happiness seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the grim reality of her disappearance. Ruslan's thoughts turned dark as he imagined the worst. What if he never found her? What if she was already gone, taken by some unseen evil lurking in the shadows? The thought was unbearable, a knife twisting in his gut. He had to find her. He couldn't let her become another statistic, another forgotten soul swallowed by the city's darkness. But where to start? He had exhausted every possible lead, and still, he was no closer to finding her. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, paralyzing him with fear and doubt. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but what good would that do? It wouldn't bring Christina back. In the quiet moments, when the panic subsided, Ruslan could almost hear her voice, a whisper in the back of his mind urging him not to give up. She was out there somewhere, waiting for him to find her. He had to keep going, no matter how hopeless it seemed. He owed her that much. With a heavy heart, Ruslan stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Somewhere in that sprawling maze of streets and buildings, his sister was waiting for him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the search that lay ahead. He might be helpless now, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Christina was out there, and he would find her, no matter what it took. The dream left Ruslan in a state of disquiet, the vivid images and sensations lingering long after he had awakened. He sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, as the remnants of the dream played out in his mind. It was more than just a nightmare, it was a door to the past, creaking open to reveal memories he had buried deep within his psyche. In the dream, he found himself back in their childhood home, a modest, weathered house on the outskirts of the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the familiar landscape. He could see his younger self, running through the yard with Christina, their laughter echoing in the evening air. Those were simpler times, days filled with the innocence of youth and the warmth of family. Their parents, now long gone, appeared in the dream as well. His father tall and strong with a kind smile, and his mother, whose gentle hands would smooth back Christina's hair as she whispered comforting words. These images were bittersweet, a reminder of a time when the world was a safer, kinder place. Ruslan felt a pang of longing for those days, a desire to return to a time when he could protect his sister with just his presence. As the dream continued, it shifted to darker tones. The house seemed to change, the walls closing in and the light fading. Ruslan found himself walking through shadowy corridors, the once familiar rooms now filled with an oppressive sense of dread. He called out for Christina, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. Panic set in as he searched desperately, each room revealing only more shadows and the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then came the most disturbing part of the dream. He saw Christina, but she was different. She stood at the end of a long, dark hallway, her eyes wide with fear. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her face was pale, and her clothes were stained with dirt and blood. The sight of her in such distress filled Ruslan with a profound sense of helplessness. He reached out to her, but she seemed to fade away, slipping further into the darkness. Ruslan awoke with a start. The final image of Christina's frightened eyes seared into his mind. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the lingering terror. The dream had felt so real, as if it were a warning or a cry for help from his sister. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that it was trying to tell him something important, something he had overlooked. The memories it stirred up only heightened his anxiety. He remembered how protective he had always been of Christina, even as children. She had always been the more adventurous one, eager to explore and push boundaries, while he had played the role of the cautious older brother, always watching out for her. His worries about her safety were not new, but they had taken on a new intensity since her disappearance. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Ruslan let the memories wash over him. He thought of their walks through the neighborhood, the games they played in the backyard, and the way she would cling to his arm when she was scared. These recollections were a stark contrast to the current reality, where she was missing, and he felt powerless to protect her. The dream had also brought back memories of their parents' warnings, their voices echoing in his mind. "Take care of your sister," his father would say. "Look out for each other," his mother would add. These admonitions now felt like a haunting reminder of his perceived failure. He had promised to keep Christina safe, and now she was out there somewhere, possibly in danger. Determined to find answers, Ruslan knew he couldn't let these memories and dreams paralyze him with fear and guilt. They had to serve as motivation, a reminder of what was at stake. Christina needed him, and he had to believe that she was still out there, waiting for him to rescue her. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ruslan rose from his bed and prepared to continue his search. The past had given him a glimpse of what he was fighting for, and the dream had reignited his determination. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could still fight to bring his sister home. The darkness that threatened to consume his family would not claim Christina, not while he still had the strength to search for her. The unsettling dream left Ruslan with an inexplicable sense of foreboding, a feeling that gnawed at his usually rational mind. As he sat in the dim light of his kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, he couldn't shake the vivid images from his sleep. The dream had been too vivid, too real, to dismiss as mere subconscious fears. Christina's haunted eyes, the darkened corridors, the sense of a malevolent presence lurking just out of sight, all of it seemed to point towards something beyond the realm of his understanding. Ruslan had always prided himself on his skepticism. He was a man who believed in facts and logic, dismissing superstitions and paranormal phenomena as fanciful nonsense. Yet the intensity of the dream, combined with the strange occurrences surrounding Christina's disappearance, began to erode the foundations of his disbelief. He recalled the oddities that had plagued him since he started searching for his sister. The 3 black sparrows that had watched him with unnerving intelligence, the whispers he sometimes thought he heard in the dead of night, the inexplicable chills that ran down his spine in certain places. Each incident had seemed insignificant on its own, but together they painted a picture that was increasingly difficult to ignore. Ruslan turned his thoughts back to the dream. He remembered the oppressive darkness, the way the familiar transformed into the sinister. He couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to the old stories and legends his grandmother used to tell him. Tales of witches and dark magic, of spirits that could reach out from beyond the veil of reality to influence the living. He had always dismissed these stories as mere folklore, but now they seemed to take on a new significance. Could it be possible that Christina's disappearance was linked to something supernatural? The rational part of his mind resisted the idea, but he couldn't deny the pattern emerging before him. The dream felt like a message, a cry for help that transcended the normal boundaries of time and space. He pondered the possibility that Christina might be trapped in a situation far more dangerous and complex than he had ever imagined. Ruslan remembered the old woman he had met at the outskirts of the village, rumored to be a witch. At the time, he had dismissed the villagers' warnings about her as superstitious nonsense. Now, he wondered if she might hold the key to understanding what was happening. Perhaps she knew something about the dark forces he was beginning to suspect were at play. With a shiver, Ruslan recalled another detail from the dream, the strange symbols etched into the walls of the dark corridor. They were unlike anything he had seen before, intricate and menacing. He had a vague recollection of seeing similar symbols in one of his grandmother's old books, a dusty tome filled with spells and incantations that she had kept hidden away. Determined to find answers, Ruslan decided to revisit his grandmother's house, now abandoned since her passing. He needed to find that book, to see if the symbols in his dream matched those within its pages. If they did, it would be the first tangible evidence linking Christina's disappearance to something otherworldly. As he prepared to leave, a thought struck him with chilling clarity. If Christina's plight was indeed tied to dark magic, then the dangers he faced were far greater than he had imagined. He would be venturing into a realm where the rules of the natural world no longer applied, where unseen forces could manipulate and deceive. Despite the fear gnawing at his resolve, Ruslan knew he had to pursue this path. He couldn't afford to ignore any possibility, no matter how outlandish it seemed. Christina's life depended on it. With a heavy heart and a mind brimming with questions, Ruslan set out towards his grandmother's house, the shadows of the past and the specters of his dreams guiding his steps into the unknown. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel that he was being watched. The sensation sent shivers down his spine, but he steeled himself against the rising tide of fear. He had to find the truth, no matter where it led him. And if that truth lay in the realm of the mystical, then so be it. He would face it head-on, driven by the love for his sister and the desperate hope of bringing her back from the brink of darkness. Despite the gnawing doubts and the persistent fear that clung to him like a second skin, Ruslan resolved to continue his investigation. He couldn't afford to let uncertainty paralyze him. Christina was out there somewhere, and he was determined to find her. The dream had shown him glimpses of her plight, and he was convinced that the answers he sought lay in tracing her final steps. As the first light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows of his apartment, Ruslan gathered his belongings. He packed a small backpack with essentials: a flashlight, a map of the surrounding villages, some food and water, and the photograph of Christina that he carried everywhere. He also included the book he had retrieved from his grandmother's house, the one filled with arcane symbols and ancient spells. It felt like a lifeline, a connection to a past that might hold the key to understanding the present. Ruslan's journey led him to the village where Christina had last been seen. It was a remote, almost forgotten place, where time seemed to stand still. The villagers eyed him warily as he arrived, their faces a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He knew better than to ask them directly about his sister. Instead, he wandered the narrow, winding streets, listening to snippets of conversation and observing the subtle dynamics of village life. The dream's imagery haunted him, particularly the symbols etched into the dark corridors. He scanned the village for anything that might resemble those markings, hoping for a clue. His search led him to the outskirts, where an old, crumbling church stood, its spire piercing the sky like a skeletal finger. The structure was covered in vines and moss, the heavy wooden door hanging ajar. Inside, the church was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of decay. Ruslan's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing rows of dilapidated pews and a cracked altar. He moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. At the back of the church, he found what he was looking for: a hidden alcove behind a rotting tapestry. The walls of the alcove were covered in the same symbols from his dream, intricately carved into the stone. Ruslan's heart pounded as he traced the patterns with his fingers. This was it, the connection he had been seeking. He pulled out his grandmother's book, comparing the symbols and noting their similarities. The realization that Christina had been here recently fueled his determination. His investigation led him deeper into the forest surrounding the village. The path was overgrown and treacherous, but he pressed on, driven by a relentless need to uncover the truth. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches forming a tangled web that blocked out the sun. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. As he ventured further, he stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was hidden among the trees, almost invisible from the main path. Ruslan's instincts told him that this place held significance. He approached cautiously, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin was a dismal place, filled with the detritus of a long-forgotten life. Ruslan's flashlight revealed broken furniture, scattered papers, and dusty shelves, but it was the marks on the floor that caught his attention. There, in the center of the room, was a large, circular symbol carved into the wood, similar to the ones in the church and his dream. Ruslan knelt to examine the symbol, his mind racing. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very walls of the cabin were watching him. He found a small, blood-stained ribbon near the symbol, and his heart clenched. It was Christina's. The realization that she had been here, that she might still be nearby, filled him with a desperate urgency. Despite the fear that gnawed at him, Ruslan knew he couldn't turn back. He had come too far, and Christina's fate depended on him. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but he steeled himself against the rising tide of dread. He had to keep moving, to follow the trail of symbols and clues that would lead him to his sister. With renewed determination, Ruslan left the cabin, plunging deeper into the forest. The journey was arduous, the terrain unforgiving, but he pressed on, guided by the hope that he was getting closer to finding Christina. Each step brought him closer to the truth, closer to unraveling the mystery that had ensnared his sister. In the heart of the forest, Ruslan stumbled upon an ancient stone altar surrounded by towering trees. The symbols carved into its surface matched those in his dream. He approached it with a mixture of awe and trepidation, sensing that he was on the verge of a significant discovery. As he examined the altar, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with the old woman from the village, the one rumored to be a witch. Her eyes bore into his, filled with a knowledge that seemed to transcend time. She spoke in a voice that was both soothing and menacing, revealing the secrets of the symbols and the dark magic that had ensnared Christina. Ruslan listened, his fear transforming into a fierce resolve. The witch's revelations confirmed his worst fears, but they also provided him with a glimmer of hope. Armed with the knowledge she imparted, Ruslan prepared to face the darkness that had taken his sister. He knew the path ahead would be perilous, but he was ready to confront whatever horrors awaited him. Determined to save Christina, Ruslan set off once more, his heart a tumult of fear and hope. The forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, shadows shifting and whispering secrets. As he ventured into the unknown, he carried with him the strength of his love for his sister and the unwavering resolve to bring her back from the brink of darkness. Ruslan sat across from his friend Ivan in the dimly lit room, the weight of the conversation pressing heavily on them both. Ivan's face was a canvas of pain and anger, etched with the lines of recent trauma. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of tension and unease. Ruslan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Ivan's with a determined intensity. "I promise you," Ivan Ruslan began, his voice low and resolute. "We will find those responsible for this. They will pay for what they've done to you." Ivan's gaze was filled with a mixture of hope and skepticism. He had been through so much, and the scars of his ordeal were both visible and deeply internalized. Ruslan knew that his words needed to carry weight, to resonate with the depth of their shared history. "I remember when we were kids," Ruslan continued, his voice softening as he delved into their past. "We used to play in the old abandoned factory at the edge of town. Do you remember how we would dare each other to explore the darkest corners, to face our fears head on? You were always the braver one, leading the way while I followed." Ivan nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I remember. You always had my back, even when things got scary." Ruslan smiled back, but his expression quickly grew serious again. "That's right. And just like back then, I'm here to back you up now. We faced those shadows together, and we'll face these new ones the same way. You're not alone in this." The room fell silent for a moment, the gravity of Ruslan's promise hanging in the air. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to underscore the darkness of their mission. "I've been thinking about what happened," Ruslan said, breaking the silence. "About the symbols, the rituals, all of it. It reminds me of the stories my grandmother used to tell us about the old ways, about the dark magic that some people still practiced in secret." Ivan's eyes widened, the memories flooding back. "Your grandmother always knew more than she let on, didn't she? She used to scare us with those tales, but now it feels like they were warnings." Ruslan nodded. "Exactly. And I think those stories hold the key to understanding what's happening now. The people who hurt you are part of something bigger, something ancient and malevolent. We need to uncover their secrets if we're going to stop them." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. "This belonged to my grandmother. It's filled with her notes and observations about the old ways, the rituals, and the symbols. I've been studying it, and I believe it can guide us." Ivan took the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the yellowed pages. The symbols and sketches seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the ink dark and foreboding. "This is incredible, Ruslan. If anyone can help me, it's you." Ruslan placed a reassuring hand on Ivan's shoulder. "We'll get through this together. We'll use everything we know, everything we've learned, to track down those responsible and make them pay. They won't get away with this." As the night wore on, the two friends pored over the journal, deciphering the cryptic notes and piecing together the puzzle. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper, but their resolve only strengthened. Ruslan's mind was a whirlwind of memories and plans, his promise to Ivan fueling his determination. "We're not just doing this for revenge," Ruslan said, his voice steady and unwavering. "We're doing it to protect others, to ensure that no one else suffers the way you have. We'll shine a light on this darkness and we'll drive it back, no matter what it takes." Ivan looked at Ruslan, gratitude and trust shining in his eyes. "I believe you, Ruslan. Together we can do this." With their bond reaffirmed and their path set, the two friends prepared for the daunting journey ahead. The night was dark and full of terrors, but they faced it with a shared purpose and an unbreakable promise. Ruslan's determination to protect his friend and uncover the truth would guide them through the shadows, leading them to a confrontation with the malevolent forces that sought to destroy them. Ruslan lay on the old, creaking bed, the shadows of the room closing in around him. His eyes fluttered shut, and he was pulled into a deep, restless sleep. The visions began almost immediately, vivid and unsettling, taking him back to a time long past, to memories he had tried to bury. In his dream, Ruslan found himself standing in the courtyard of their childhood home. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the sun cast long, eerie shadows across the ground. He saw his sister Christina, as she had been years ago, a bright, spirited girl with a cascade of dark hair and a laugh that could chase away the darkest of clouds. She was running through the yard, her laughter echoing off the trees, her joy infectious. Their father stood by the old oak tree, his stern face softened by a rare smile. He was a man of few words, but his presence had always been a comforting anchor for Ruslan and Christina. In this dream he seemed more relaxed, more human than Ruslan had remembered. His father's hands were calloused and strong, the hands of a man who had worked hard all his life, but they were gentle as he reached out to ruffle Christina's hair. The scene shifted, and Ruslan found himself in their family's small, cluttered living room. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with dusty tomes and ancient relics, remnants of their father's interest in folklore and the occult. Ruslan remembered how his father used to sit by the fireplace, reading aloud from these books, his voice a deep, soothing rumble. Christina would sit on the floor, her eyes wide with fascination, while Ruslan listened from the doorway, torn between skepticism and curiosity. A darker memory surfaced, one that Ruslan had tried to forget. It was the night their mother had left, a night shrouded in mystery and pain. He saw her silhouette framed in the doorway, her face hidden in shadows. There had been whispered arguments, tears, and finally the slamming of the door as she walked out of their lives forever. His father had never spoken of her again, and the house had felt emptier ever since. In his dream, Ruslan felt a sharp pang of guilt and sorrow. He had always blamed himself for their mother's departure, wondering if he had been the cause of her unhappiness. Christina had tried to console him, but even her boundless optimism couldn't fill the void their mother had left behind. The dream shifted again, and Ruslan was standing by a river, the water dark and swift. He saw himself and Christina as children, playing by the water's edge. Christina had slipped and fallen in, her laughter turning to cries for help as the current pulled her away. Ruslan had jumped in without hesitation, his heart pounding with fear. He remembered the cold grip of the water, the desperate struggle to reach her. He had managed to pull her to safety, but the memory of her terror and his own helplessness had haunted him ever since. The images blurred and twisted, and Ruslan found himself back in the present, standing in the same courtyard, now overgrown and abandoned. The oak tree was dead, its branches skeletal against the darkening sky. He heard a whisper on the wind, a voice that sounded like Christina's calling his name. He turned, but saw only shadows. The dream ended abruptly, and Ruslan awoke with a start, his heart racing. He was back in the dim room, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. The pain of the past was raw, and the sense of loss overwhelming. He realized that the memories were not just painful, they were clues, pieces of a puzzle that he needed to solve to find his sister and understand the dark forces at play. Ruslan sat up, his resolve hardening. The past held the answers he sought, and he would face it, no matter how painful. His love for Christina and his determination to find her were stronger than the ghosts of his memories. He would delve into the mysteries of his family's past, confront the shadows that had haunted them, and uncover the truth, no matter where it led. Ruslan sat alone in his dimly lit room, the flickering candle casting eerie shadows on the walls. His gaze fell on the intricate tattoo that spiraled around his forearm, a design he had never fully understood. It was a dark and complex pattern, interwoven with symbols and lines that seemed almost alive, shifting subtly under the candlelight. The tattoo had been a part of him for as long as he could remember, but he had never known its true origin or meaning. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to the whispers of his father about the twins with the dawn. The phrase had always puzzled him, a cryptic riddle that seemed to be tied to his family's past. His father had spoken of it in hushed tones, as if it were a forbidden secret. Ruslan remembered the nights when his father would sit by the fireplace, lost in thought, his eyes distant and troubled. There had been moments when Ruslan had caught glimpses of old, yellowed pages filled with ancient runes and illustrations of twin figures standing at the break of dawn. Ruslan's quest for answers had always been overshadowed by the more immediate concern of finding his sister Christina. But now, as he delved deeper into the mystery of her disappearance, he found himself drawn back to the enigma of his tattoo and the twins with the dawn. There was a nagging feeling that these elements were interconnected, pieces of a larger puzzle that he needed to solve to uncover the truth. He recalled a specific night, years ago, when he had asked his father about the tattoo. His father had looked at him with a mixture of sorrow and fear, his voice trembling as he explained that the tattoo was a mark of protection, a symbol that bound their family to ancient magic. The twins with the dawn, he had said, are guardians, beings of immense power that watch over us as the night gives way to day. But they also represent a duality, a balance between light and darkness. Those words had haunted Ruslan ever since. He had never fully understood their meaning, but they had left an indelible mark on his psyche. Now, with Christina missing and strange, unexplainable events unfolding around him, he felt a growing urgency to decipher this riddle. The tattoo seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent reminder that time was running out. Ruslan decided to start his investigation with the old family attic, a place he had avoided for years. The attic was a repository of forgotten relics and dusty tomes, remnants of his father's obsession with the occult. As he climbed the creaking stairs, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air was thick with dust and the scent of aged paper. He rummaged through boxes and old trunks, uncovering faded photographs, brittle letters, and strange artifacts that seemed to hum with latent energy. After hours of searching, he found an ancient, leather-bound book that seemed to call out to him. Its cover was embossed with the same symbols as his tattoo, and the title, written in a language he could barely decipher, hinted at secrets long buried. As he opened the book, a cascade of images and runes spilled forth, each page revealing more about the twins with the dawn. They were depicted as ethereal beings, their forms shifting between human and celestial, always standing at the threshold of darkness and light. The text spoke of a prophecy, a lineage of protectors marked by the same tattoo that adorned Ruslan's arm. These protectors were destined to guard against a great evil that sought to rise as the dawn broke. The twins with the dawn were not just guardians but also a symbol of an eternal struggle, a battle that Ruslan now realized he was a part of. As he read, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The strange occurrences, the disappearance of Christina, and the eerie presence of the black sparrows all pointed to a looming threat that had been foretold in these ancient texts. Ruslan's tattoo was not just a mark of protection but a beacon, drawing him towards his destiny. With a newfound resolve, Ruslan closed the book and looked at his tattoo with a sense of purpose. The mysteries of his past were beginning to unravel, and he knew that finding Christina was not just about saving his sister, but also about fulfilling a destiny that had been written long before he was born. The answers he sought lay in the shadows of the past, and he was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. Ruslan boarded the old, creaking bus that would take him to the remote village where he hoped to find traces of his missing sister, Christina. The summer heat was stifling, the bus crowded with silent, brooding passengers. He found a seat near a dusty window, watching as the cityscape gradually gave way to sprawling fields and dense forests. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the swaying motion of the bus did little to soothe his nerves. As the bus rattled along the narrow, winding road, Ruslan began to notice strange things. The first sign was a dilapidated wooden signpost at the edge of a forest. It was covered in faded symbols that looked like they had been carved ages ago. The symbols were vaguely familiar, reminiscent of the strange patterns he had seen in his recurring dreams. The further the bus ventured, the more unsettling the surroundings became. Ruslan saw a flock of blackbirds circling high above, their caws echoing eerily through the still air. They weren't ordinary crows or ravens but seemed larger, their feathers glinting with an unnatural sheen. He shuddered, recalling the black sparrows that had first caught his attention at the train station. The trees along the roadside grew denser, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Occasionally, the bus would pass by old, abandoned houses, their windows shattered, roofs caved in, and walls covered in creeping vines. Each one seemed to hold its own story of decay and desolation. Ruslan's anxiety heightened when he saw a peculiar-sighted deer standing motionless by the side of the road. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, almost as if it were watching him, understanding his plight. As the bus rumbled past, the deer didn't flinch or move. It simply stared, its gaze piercing and unnerving. Further along, the bus passed a small cemetery, its wrought iron gate hanging ajar. The tombstones were old and weathered, many of them tilted or fallen over. Ruslan spotted something that made his blood run cold, a single black feather lying atop one of the graves, stark against the pale stone. As the bus continued, Ruslan began to feel an oppressive weight in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with some malevolent force. The final stretch of the journey took them through a particularly dense part of the forest. Here, the trees seemed to close in around the road, their branches forming twisted shapes that cast unsettling shadows on the ground. Ruslan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced nervously at the other passengers, but they seemed oblivious, lost in their own thoughts. Just as he was beginning to think that his mind was playing tricks on him, he noticed something that made his heart race. Carved into the bark of a massive oak tree was a symbol he had seen in his dreams, a crude, unsettling depiction of a bird with a single white feather. His hands clenched the seat in front of him as the bus finally emerged from the forest and rolled into the village. The village itself was a bleak, isolated place. The houses were old, their wooden walls warped and cracked. The streets were empty, save for a few stray dogs that slunk away into the shadows as the bus approached. Ruslan stepped off the bus, his heart pounding. He looked around, taking in the eerie silence and the feeling of abandonment that hung heavy in the air. The journey had left him shaken, but he was more determined than ever to find out what had happened to Christina. He took a deep breath and started walking towards the village center, ready to face whatever mysteries and dangers lay ahead. As Ruslan made his way through the desolate village, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood or the distant rustle of leaves. His senses were on high alert, every shadow and movement catching his eye. He passed by several abandoned houses, their windows dark and lifeless, the doors hanging ajar, as if inviting him into their depths of decay. Then he heard it, the low growl that sent a shiver down his spine. He turned slowly to see a pack of dogs emerging from an alleyway. These were not ordinary village dogs. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their fur was matted and filthy. They moved with a predatory grace, their growls growing louder as they approached. Ruslan's heart began to race. He tried to back away slowly, but the dogs closed in, forming a tight circle around him. Their teeth bared, they looked more like wolves than domestic animals. The largest of the pack, a hulking black beast with scars across its snout, stepped forward, its eyes fixed on Ruslan. He knew he had to act fast. Before he could react, the lead dog lunged at him. Ruslan managed to sidestep, but the beast's claws raked across his arm, tearing through his shirt and skin. The pain was immediate and searing. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance, but the other dogs took this as their cue to attack. They snapped at his legs, their jaws clamping down with terrifying force. Ruslan swung his backpack at them, trying to fend them off. The weight of the bag momentarily pushed back one of the smaller dogs, but it wasn't enough to deter the pack. The largest dog leaped again, this time knocking Ruslan to the ground. He felt the air rush out of his lungs as he hit the hard earth. The dogs were on him in an instant, their teeth sinking into his flesh. Desperation fueled his actions. Ruslan kicked out wildly, managing to connect with one of the dogs, sending it yelping away. He used the brief reprieve to scramble to his feet, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the ground. Swinging it with all his might, he struck at the dogs, trying to keep them at bay. The largest dog circled him, its eyes filled with a malevolent intelligence. Just as Ruslan felt his strength waning, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The dogs immediately froze, their ears perking up. Another whistle, and they began to retreat, their snarls turning to whimpers. Confused and bleeding, Ruslan watched as the pack slunk back into the shadows from where they came. Out of the darkness emerged a figure. A woman, tall and slender, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Her face was lined with age, but her gaze was sharp and youthful. She moved with an eerie grace, her presence commanding and unsettling. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Ruslan, clutching his wounded arm, nodded weakly. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You should come with me," she said. "Those wounds need tending, and it's not safe out here after dark." With little choice, Ruslan followed her, hoping that she might have some answers, or at least a safe place to rest. As they walked, he couldn't help but feel that his journey was leading him deeper into a mystery far darker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. As the dogs closed in, Ruslan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to act quickly to avoid being overwhelmed. With a burst of adrenaline, he swung his backpack in a wide arc, using it as a makeshift weapon. The sudden movement caught the dogs off guard. They hesitated, their growls momentarily silenced as they regarded this unexpected defiance. Ruslan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He realized that showing fear or attempting to retreat would only provoke the dogs further. He needed to stand his ground and project confidence. He tightened his grip on the backpack and held it out in front of him like a shield, staring down the pack leader. The large black dog with scarred snout seemed to consider him for a moment, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Get back," Ruslan commanded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. He took a step forward, swinging the backpack again, and the dogs flinched, backing away slightly. The lead dog growled low in its throat, but it didn't advance. Ruslan sensed that the pack was testing him, waiting for a moment of weakness. Determined not to give them one, Ruslan planted his feet firmly on the ground. He kept his eyes locked on the leader, knowing that any sign of retreat could trigger another attack. The dogs circled him warily, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. The tension was palpable, a standoff between man and beast. Ruslan's mind raced, searching for a strategy to turn the situation to his advantage. He knew he couldn't keep swinging his backpack indefinitely. He needed to show the dogs that he wasn't afraid, and that he was ready to fight if necessary. Summoning his courage, he took another step forward, brandishing the backpack with more force. "Back off," he shouted again, louder this time. The pack leader snarled but didn't move. Ruslan held his ground, refusing to back down. The other dogs seemed to take their cue from the leader, shifting nervously but not advancing. For what felt like an eternity, Ruslan and the dogs remained locked in this tense standoff. His arms ached from holding the backpack aloft, but he didn't dare lower it. He knew he had to outlast them, to prove that he wasn't an easy target. Gradually, the pack's aggression began to wane. The dogs' growls softened, and their stance relaxed. The lead dog took a step back, then another. Sensing a shift in their demeanor, Ruslan pressed his advantage, taking a bold step forward and shouting, "Go!" The dogs retreated further, their snarls turning to whimpers. One by one, they backed away, disappearing into the shadows from which they had emerged. Ruslan didn't move until the last of them had gone, his muscles taut with the effort of maintaining his defensive posture. When he was finally alone, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. His body trembled from the adrenaline, and the pain from his wounds flared up, but he had survived. Ruslan looked around, ensuring the dogs were truly gone, before lowering his backpack and assessing his injuries. The silence of the village returned, the oppressive atmosphere once again settling over the abandoned streets. Ruslan knew he had to find help for his wounds and a safe place to regroup. With renewed determination, he continued his journey, each step taking him deeper into the mystery and danger that awaited him. Just as Ruslan began to regain his breath, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the night air. The sound was otherworldly, sending a shiver down his spine. The pack of dogs, which had been preparing for another assault, froze instantly. Their ears perked up, and they turned their heads toward the source of the whistle. Another whistle followed, even sharper, and the dogs began to retreat, their aggressive demeanor dissipating as quickly as it had appeared. Ruslan's heart still pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to locate where the sound had come from. From the edge of the forest, a figure emerged, moving with an eerie grace. As she came closer, Ruslan could make out more details. The woman was an enigma. Her dark eyes seemed to hold the secrets of ages, and deep wrinkles etched her face, betraying her years. Yet there was a strange vitality about her, an almost youthful aura that seemed out of place. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm and soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. She approached Ruslan without hesitation, her movements fluid and confident. Ruslan, still on edge, watched her warily but felt an odd sense of reassurance in her presence. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken," Ruslan replied, his voice trembling slightly. He winced as the pain from his wounds flared up again. "Let me see those," the woman said, kneeling beside him. She gently took his arm, examining the gashes left by the dog's teeth. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, and her hands were warm despite the cool night air. "These need to be cleaned and bandaged. You're lucky they didn't do more damage." Ruslan nodded, too exhausted to argue. The woman pulled a small vial from her bag, along with some clean cloths. She poured a clear liquid onto one of the cloths and began to clean his wounds. The liquid stung, but Ruslan bit his lip and endured the pain. The woman worked quickly and efficiently, her focus entirely on his injuries. "Thank you," Ruslan managed to say through gritted teeth. The woman gave him a small smile. "You're welcome. My name is Elena. I live not far from here. It's not safe to be out in the open, especially at night. You should come with me. We can finish treating these wounds properly." Ruslan hesitated for a moment but realized he had little choice. He was in no condition to continue on his own. "All right," he agreed. Elena helped him to his feet, supporting him as they walked. Her presence was oddly comforting, and despite the pain and confusion, Ruslan felt a glimmer of hope. They made their way through the forest, Elena leading the way with confidence. The path was narrow and winding, but she navigated it with ease. As they walked, Ruslan couldn't help but wonder about this mysterious woman who had appeared out of nowhere and saved him from the dogs. There was something almost supernatural about her, a sense of power and knowledge that seemed beyond the ordinary. But for now, all he could do was follow her and hope that she truly meant to help him. They eventually arrived at a small, quaint cottage nestled among the trees. The place exuded a warmth and coziness that contrasted sharply with the eerie forest. Elena led Ruslan inside, where the soft glow of lanterns illuminated a simple but well-kept interior. "Sit here," Elena instructed, guiding Ruslan to a chair. She disappeared into another room and returned with more medical supplies. As she tended to his wounds, Ruslan felt his anxiety begin to fade, replaced by a weary sense of relief. "Thank you again," he said, his voice softer now. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Elena looked at him with those deep, dark eyes and smiled gently. "You're safe now," she said. "Rest. We'll talk more in the morning. For now, you need to heal." As Ruslan settled into the chair, exhaustion overtook him. His eyelids grew heavy, and before he knew it, he was drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep, the mysterious woman watching over him. Elena led Ruslan through the dense forest with an assuredness that spoke volumes about her familiarity with the area. The night was alive with sounds: the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Ruslan felt a growing sense of trust in Elena. Her confidence was palpable, and he couldn't help but be reassured by her presence. "We're almost there," she said softly, her voice carrying easily in the still night air. Ruslan could just make out the outline of a small village through the trees. The dim lights from the cottages flickered like distant stars, offering a promise of warmth and safety. As they emerged from the forest, they approached a quaint, old-fashioned cottage. The place had a rustic charm, with its wooden walls and thatched roof. Elena opened the door and gestured for Ruslan to enter. Inside, the cottage was cozy and inviting. The smell of herbs and fresh bread filled the air, and a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. "Welcome," said a woman who stepped forward to greet them. She was of medium height, with kind eyes and a nurturing presence. "I'm Elena," she introduced herself, giving Ruslan a reassuring smile. "Elena told me you needed help. "Come, sit down." Ruslan, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion, allowed himself to be guided to a chair near the fire. The warmth was comforting against the chill of the night, and he sank into the seat gratefully. Alina busied herself with preparing a makeshift infirmary on the kitchen table, laying out various jars and vials of herbs and ointments. "Let's take a look at that wound," she said, her voice calm and soothing. She carefully removed the makeshift bandage that Elena had applied and examined the injury. "It's not too deep, but it does need proper cleaning and dressing." Alina fetched a pot of water from the fireplace and poured it into a bowl, mixing in a blend of herbs that gave off a pungent, medicinal smell. "This will sting," she warned gently as she dipped a cloth into the hot water and began to clean the wound. Ruslan winced as the hot liquid made contact with his skin, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his leg. But he bit his lip and endured it, knowing it was necessary. Once the wound was clean, Alina applied a thick, warm poultice that immediately began to soothe the pain. "This will help draw out any infection," she explained as she expertly bandaged his leg. "You'll need to rest for a while. Give it time to heal properly." Ruslan nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You're safe here," Alina replied, her eyes meeting his with a reassuring gaze. "Rest now. We'll take care of you." As the initial shock and pain began to subside, Ruslan felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since the ordeal began. The combined warmth of the fire and the care he received was almost overwhelming in its comfort. He looked around the cottage, noting the simple yet homely decorations, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, handmade quilts draped over the furniture, and a small shelf filled with well-worn books. Alina brought him a cup of herbal tea. "Drink this. It will help you relax and sleep." Ruslan took the cup and sipped the warm liquid, feeling its calming effects almost immediately. His eyelids grew heavy, and he struggled to stay awake. But the combined exhaustion from his ordeal and the soothing atmosphere of the cottage was too much to resist. "Thank you," he murmured again, his voice trailing off as sleep overcame him. Alina and Elena exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. "Rest now," Alina whispered. "You're safe here." As Ruslan drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, he felt, for the first time in days, a glimmer of hope. As Alina continued to apply the hot herbal poultice to Ruslan's wound, he felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through his leg. He clenched his teeth, trying to withstand the discomfort, but it was overwhelming. The room began to spin, and his vision blurred at the edges. The combined pain and the potent effects of the herbal concoction were too much for his exhausted body to bear. "I can't," he managed to whisper before his strength gave out. The last thing he saw was Alina's concerned face hovering over him before everything went dark. He slipped into unconsciousness, his mind descending into a deep, black void where time and pain no longer existed. Ruslan's consciousness slowly began to return. He became aware of a soft surface beneath him and the faint, comforting smell of herbs lingering in the air. His eyelids felt heavy, as if weighted down, but he forced them open, blinking against the light filtering into the room. He found himself lying on a bed in a small, dimly lit room that he did not recognize. The room was simple, with wooden walls and a single window covered by a lace curtain that fluttered gently in the breeze. A small table with a candle and a few bottles of herbs stood nearby. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. Ruslan shifted slightly, and as he did, he noticed his leg. The wound had been expertly bandaged, the layers of cloth clean and neatly wrapped. He tentatively moved his leg, expecting the sharp pain to return, but was surprised to find it had dulled considerably. He propped himself up on his elbows and took a closer look. The swelling had gone down, and though the area was still tender, it was clear that the treatment had been effective. He felt a strange mixture of relief and disorientation. The events of the previous night came back to him in fragments: the attack by the dogs, Alina's intervention, the trek through the forest, and the intense pain as Alina treated his wound. Now, in the quiet of the unfamiliar room, it all felt like a distant nightmare. Ruslan slowly sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His body ached from the ordeal, but the intense fatigue had lifted somewhat. He took a deep breath, the scent of herbs calming his nerves. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten properly in days. He glanced around the room, wondering if Elena or Alina were nearby. Just as he was about to call out, the door creaked open, and Alina entered, carrying a tray with a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. She smiled warmly when she saw him awake. "Good to see you're up," she said, setting the tray down on the small table beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Ruslan replied, his voice still hoarse from sleep. "Thank you. The pain is much less now." Alina nodded, satisfied. "That's good to hear. The herbs are working then. You need to rest and eat. Your body has been through a lot." Ruslan reached for the bowl of soup, the warm steam rising to meet his face. He took a sip, savoring the rich, comforting flavor. It was exactly what he needed. As he ate, he looked at Alina, who watched him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Thank you," he said again between bites. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You're welcome," Alina replied, her expression softening. "We're here to help, and we want to know more about what brought you to our village, but that can wait until you've recovered a bit more. For now, just focus on getting your strength back." Ruslan nodded, grateful for the respite and the kindness of his unexpected hosts. As he finished his meal, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He was closer to finding out what had happened to his sister, and he knew that with Alina and Alina's help, he might finally uncover the truth. Alina brought out a steaming pot of stew and a loaf of fresh bread, placing them on the wooden table in front of Ruslan. The aroma of the hearty meal filled the small room, mingling with the herbal scents that still lingered in the air. Ruslan's stomach growled in anticipation, and he eagerly accepted the bowl of stew Alina handed him. "Eat up," she encouraged with a warm smile. "You need your strength." Ruslan dipped the bread into the thick broth, savoring the rich flavors as he took a bite. The food was comforting, a welcome change from the constant anxiety and fear he had been living with since his sister's disappearance. As he ate, Alina sat across from him, her dark eyes studying him intently. After a few moments of comfortable silence, Ruslan decided to broach the subject that weighed heavily on his mind. "Have you seen a young woman around here recently?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Her name is Christina. She's my sister, and she's been missing for some time now." Alina's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, Ruslan. I haven't seen anyone like that," she replied, her tone sincere but enigmatic. "This village is quite remote. We don't get many visitors." Despite her answer, there was something in her demeanor that made Ruslan feel she was withholding something. He decided not to press further, realizing it might be best to build more trust first. As they continued their meal, Ruslan decided to steer the conversation towards learning more about Alina herself. "You seem very skilled in herbal medicine," he remarked, hoping to keep the conversation light. "Have you always lived here?" Alina chuckled softly, a hint of pride in her voice. "Yes, I've always been here. My mother taught me everything I know. This village might be small and isolated, but it has a wealth of knowledge passed down through generations." Ruslan nodded, intrigued. It must be quite a responsibility, being the village healer. "It is," Alina admitted, "but it's also a calling. I believe in the power of nature to heal and protect. We live in harmony with the forest, and it provides us with everything we need." Her words carried a certain conviction, a strength that Ruslan found both comforting and unsettling. He could see the depth of her connection to the land and its mysteries, a bond that seemed almost mystical. "I've heard some people refer to you as a witch," Ruslan ventured cautiously. "Is that how you see yourself?" Alina's eyes sparkled with amusement. People love to use that word. To me, being a witch simply means understanding the world in ways that others might not. It's about knowledge and respect for the forces around us. I help people with that knowledge whether they understand it or not. Her words resonated with Ruslan, though they also reminded him of the stories his grandmother used to tell, tales of powerful women who could heal or curse with equal ease. There was an aura about Alina that suggested she was more than just a healer, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "I can see why people here trust you," Ruslan said, finishing his stew. "You have a gift." Alina smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Gifts can be burdens too. But we make do with what we have. Now, rest some more. We can talk later if you have more questions. Ruslan nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. As he lay back down to rest, he couldn't shake the feeling that Alina knew more than she was letting on. But for now, he needed her help, and he hoped that in time, she might reveal the secrets she held. As the afternoon light filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow over the room, Ruslan felt a heaviness settle in his chest. Alina had left to gather more herbs, giving him time to think and process everything that had happened. His thoughts drifted inevitably to Christina, the sister he had been desperately searching for. Christina had always been different, a bright spirit shadowed by dark clouds. Growing up, she was the kind of person who wore her heart on her sleeve, falling in love easily and deeply. Unfortunately, her romantic endeavors often ended in heartbreak and despair. She seemed to attract the wrong kind of men, those who saw her vulnerability as something to exploit rather than cherish. Time and again, Christina found herself in relationships that quickly turned toxic. The men she loved would reveal their true, ugly natures, leaving her emotionally scarred. The cycle of love and pain became a grim pattern in her life. Each breakup left her more disillusioned, more desperate for genuine connection, yet also more fragile. In her quest for solace, Christina turned to various sources of help. She visited psychologists, hoping to find someone who could help her understand and break the destructive cycle. However, the therapy sessions brought little relief. The psychologist's words felt empty, their advice ineffective against the depth of her emotional wounds. Desperate for a solution, Christina also sought out less conventional methods. She visited self-proclaimed healers and spiritualists, paying hefty fees to charlatans who promised quick fixes and miraculous cures. These encounters, too, ended in disappointment, leaving her feeling more lost and betrayed. Unable to find the help she so desperately needed, Christina began to seek refuge in self-medication. She started with mild sedatives, hoping they would calm her troubled mind and help her sleep. When those failed to provide relief, she turned to stronger substances. The drugs offered a temporary escape, plunging her into a numbing oblivion where her pain was momentarily forgotten. But the relief was fleeting. Each time she surfaced from the haze of drugs, her problems remained, intensified by the added burden of addiction. Her physical and mental health deteriorated, her once vibrant spirit now dulled by the weight of her struggles. Ruslan remembered the countless nights he spent worrying about her, trying to reach out and offer support. He had begged her to stop, to find another way, but Christina was trapped in a downward spiral. She pushed him away, insisting she could handle it on her own, even as it became clear that she was losing control. Her disappearance had been the final, terrifying twist in her tragic story. Ruslan's heart ached as he thought of what she must have endured, the loneliness and despair that had driven her to vanish. He had to find her, to save her from the darkness that had claimed so much of her life. Despite all her efforts, Christina never found true love. Her relationships were marred by violence and betrayal, leaving her disillusioned and scarred. Each new attempt at love ended in pain, a pattern that seemed impossible to break. The search for genuine connection became a torturous journey, one that left her more wounded with each step. Ruslan, now recovering from his injuries in Alina's warm kitchen, watched her carefully as she moved about, preparing a simple meal. The aroma of freshly baked bread and herbal tea filled the air, but his thoughts were fixated on Christina. He had to know if Alina had seen her. "Alina," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "have you ever seen my sister, Christina? She disappeared a while ago, and I'm desperate to find her." Alina paused, her dark eyes meeting his with a look of sincere concern. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," she said softly, shaking her head. "This village is small, and newcomers are rare. If she had come through here, I would likely have noticed." Ruslan felt a pang of disappointment and confusion. Alina's words seemed genuine, but something about her calm demeanor made him uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. Still, he had no choice but to trust her for now. Sensing his despair, Alina reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "There is someone who might be able to help," she said. The local constable, Ivan, knows everyone in these parts. If anyone has seen your sister, he would know. Ruslan's heart lifted slightly at this new lead. Where can I find him? He asked eagerly. He's usually at the village's small station house, but he's been away for a few days, Alina replied. He might be back by tomorrow. In the meantime, you can rest here. When he returns, I can take you to see him. Though the waiting was agonizing, Ruslan nodded, grateful for any direction. The village and its eerie surroundings held many secrets, and he was determined to uncover the truth about Christina's fate. He couldn't afford to miss any opportunity, no matter how tenuous, to find his sister. As Ruslan wandered through the village in search of clues about Christina, he encountered a rugged man with a fiery red beard, who seemed to know more than most about the eerie happenings in the area. The man approached him with a cautious but friendly demeanor, his eyes scanning Ruslan with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Looking for something, stranger, the man asked, his voice gravelly yet strangely comforting amidst the quiet of the village. Ruslan hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But desperation pushed him forward. My sister, Christina, he began, his voice slightly trembling. She disappeared some time ago. Have you seen her? The man scratched his beard thoughtfully before speaking. Can't say I've seen your sister, but I've seen things around here, he said cryptically. There's talk of a witch, they say, living out in the woods. Some believe she holds secrets that could explain the disappearances. Ruslan listened intently as the man recounted a chilling tale. I was out by the river one evening, he began, his eyes distant, as if reliving the moment. Caught a glimpse of something in the water, something unnatural. It spooked me good, I tell ya. Left my fishing gear and bucket right there and ran for the bushes. The hairs on Ruslan's neck stood on end as he imagined the terror the man must have felt. The mention of a witch and eerie sightings only deepened the mystery surrounding Christina's disappearance. But the man wasn't finished. There was another time, he continued, his voice dropping to a hushed tone. Tracks of a wild boar I found near my son's home. Thought it was just bad luck, but then my boy fell into a crisis soon after. Some say it was a sign of trouble coming. Ruslan's mind raced with questions. Could these strange occurrences be linked somehow to Christina? Was the witch real, or merely a superstition born out of fear? He thanked the man for his insights, though he left their encounter with more unease than answers. Armed with new tales of the supernatural and a growing sense of dread, Ruslan knew he had to tread carefully in his quest for Christina. The village held more secrets than he had ever imagined, and each step he took seemed to draw him deeper into its mysterious web. Ruslan leaned in, captivated by the man's unsettling tale. The man recounted how he had stumbled upon tracks of a wild boar near his son's home, an ominous sign that he initially dismissed as mere bad luck. However, shortly after discovering the tracks, his son fell into a sudden crisis, leaving him shaken and searching for answers. Curiosity burning within him, Ruslan pressed further, seeking more details about the crisis that befell the man's son. The man's response was hesitant yet earnest, revealing that the incident had occurred recently, and that he himself was still piecing together the full extent of what had transpired. As the conversation unfolded, the man's tone shifted subtly, his voice tinged with suspicion. He began to hint at his murky doubts regarding the involvement of some locals in Christina's disappearance. His words painted a picture of hidden motives and deception lurking beneath the surface of the tranquil village life. Ruslan's mind raced with possibilities. Could there be a connection between the wild boar tracks, the crisis involving the man's son, and Christina's vanishing? The man's vague insinuations only added to the growing sense of foreboding that enveloped him. Armed with these new insights, Ruslan resolved to tread cautiously. The village seemed to hold more secrets than he had ever imagined, and unraveling them could lead him closer to uncovering the truth behind Christina's mysterious disappearance. Ruslan nodded solemnly as the man confirmed the whereabouts of the local constable and his absence from the village. The eerie silence that followed seemed to amplify the weight of their conversation, reinforcing Ruslan's resolve to proceed cautiously. With a plan forming in his mind, Ruslan made a silent vow to tread carefully, keeping his intentions veiled from the prying eyes of the villagers. Nightfall would be his ally, shrouding his movements as he prepared to embark on his clandestine investigation. As Ruslan pondered his next steps, he encountered Alina, the enchanting witch of the village. Her presence was captivating, her allure drawing him in like a moth to a flame. Ruslan found himself momentarily struck dumb, his words caught in his throat as he gazed upon her mysterious beauty. Her eyes, dark and intense, seemed to hold secrets untold, hinting at a world beyond the ordinary. Ruslan felt a mix of fascination and unease, unsure of the depths hidden beneath her enchanting facade. Yet, despite his instincts urging caution, there was an inexplicable pull that kept him rooted in her presence. Alina's demeanor exuded confidence and a quiet strength, contrasting sharply with the unsettling aura of mystery that surrounded her. Ruslan couldn't shake the feeling that she held keys to truths he had yet to uncover, and that her involvement in the unfolding events was far from coincidental. With every passing moment in her presence, Ruslan's resolve to uncover the mysteries of the village deepened, even as he grappled with the unsettling realization that he might be entangled in a web spun by forces beyond his comprehension. As Ruslan sat across from Alina, he couldn't help but notice her physical attributes. Her eyes, dark and enigmatic, seemed to pierce through his very soul. Her movements were graceful, almost hypnotic, and he found himself drawn to her in a way that both excited and terrified him. She moved closer, and her touch sent shivers down his spine. He could feel his body responding to her, a mixture of attraction and dread coursing through his veins. Alina's fingers brushed against his arm, and Ruslan felt an overwhelming sense of weakness. It was as if she had tapped into his very essence, using her powers to manipulate his emotions and physical state. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, desire, and fear. He wanted to pull away, but his body betrayed him, leaning into her touch, craving the strange comfort it brought. With a knowing smile, Alina began to chant in a language Ruslan couldn't understand. Her words were like a melody, weaving a spell around him, binding him to her will. He tried to fight it, but his limbs felt heavy, his thoughts sluggish. The room seemed to blur, and all he could focus on was Alina's voice, her eyes, her touch. The ritual she performed tightened its grip on him, and he knew he was powerless to resist. Ruslan's last conscious thought was a fleeting realization of his vulnerability, as he succumbed entirely to Alina's enchantment. She had ensnared him, body and soul, leaving him at her mercy, a puppet in the hands of a masterful sorceress. Ruslan's head swam as the enchantment took hold, Alina's voice echoing in the recesses of his mind. As the fog of her spell lifted just enough for him to grasp his surroundings, she began to speak, her tone now laced with a strange familiarity and authority. "Ruslan," she said, her voice smooth and commanding, "do you remember your past? The secrets buried deep within your family." Ruslan's vision blurred, and memories he had long buried began to surface. He saw flashes of his childhood, moments of joy overshadowed by dark events, tragedies that had shaped him, events he had tried to forget. The death of his parents, the mysterious disappearance of his sister. His heart ached as these long-suppressed memories rushed back, more vivid and painful than ever. Alina's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she saw the recognition in his eyes. "You were meant to forget," she murmured, her fingers tracing patterns on his arm. "But now you must remember. Your sister Christina, she sought answers just as you do now. But she came to me, willingly." Ruslan's heart pounded in his chest. The thought of Christina in the clutches of this witch filled him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Alina smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent chills down his spine. She wanted to escape her pain, and I offered her away. But now she is lost. Unless you help me, you will never see her again. The offer hung in the air, a poisoned fruit he was compelled to take. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alina moved closer, her body pressing against his, her breath hot on his skin. "Your loyalty, your obedience," she purred. "Become part of my plan, and I will give you the answers you seek." Ruslan felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. The combination of her physical allure and the promise of finding Christina was intoxicating. He knew he was being manipulated, but he was powerless to resist. Alina's touch was both a balm and a curse, a seductive trap from which he could not extricate himself. He nodded slowly, surrendering to her will. Alina's smile widened, and she leaned in to kiss him, sealing his fate. As her lips met his, he felt a dark energy envelop him, binding him to her. His body responded instinctively, drawn deeper into her web of seduction and control. Ruslan was now a pawn in Alina's sinister game, ensnared by her charms and bound by a promise. The witch had him where she wanted him, and the path ahead was fraught with peril and desire. He was trapped, both body and soul, in a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Ruslan's heart pounded as he tore himself away from Alina's grasp. The enchantment that had ensnared him moments ago seemed to falter, replaced by a desperate urge to escape. He stumbled out of the dimly lit bathhouse, the cold night air hitting his face like a splash of icy water. Behind him, the witch's incantations twisted and contorted, unraveling into something malevolent and uncontrollable. As Ruslan ran, he heard Alina's voice rise into a high-pitched keening, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. He glanced back and saw her thrashing, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows around her seemed to deepen, and strange flickering lights danced in the periphery of his vision. Her own spells were consuming her, pulling her into a chaotic vortex of her own making. The forest around him came alive with unnatural sounds. The rustling of leaves turned into whispers, and the creaking branches seemed to groan with otherworldly agony. Ruslan's fear mounted as he pressed forward, pushing through the underbrush with renewed urgency. Behind him, Alina's cries grew louder, mingling with guttural growls and dissonant, ethereal music. He couldn't help but look back again. What he saw rooted him to the spot. Alina was enveloped in a swirling mass of dark energy. Her body convulsed as ghostly apparitions materialized around her, their forms shifting and shimmering like wraiths in the moonlight. Her once commanding presence was now a spectacle of horror, her features twisted in a grotesque mask of fear and pain. Suddenly, a flock of black birds, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light, descended upon her. They pecked and clawed, driven by a demonic force that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the witch's soul. She screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, as the birds attacked with relentless fury. Blood and feathers filled the air, and the cacophony of screeches and flapping wings drowned out her cries. Ruslan felt a surge of nausea and terror. The sight was both mesmerizing and revolting. Alina, once so powerful and alluring, was now a pitiful victim of the dark forces she had sought to control. The demonic energy that had been summoned was now consuming her, turning her into a conduit of its malevolent will. With a final, wrenching scream, Alina was pulled into the heart of the dark vortex. The birds scattered, and the forest fell eerily silent. Ruslan stood, trembling, trying to process the surreal and horrifying scene he had just witnessed. The air around him felt heavy with an oppressive, lingering darkness. He knew he had to keep moving, to put as much distance between himself and the sight of Alina's demise as possible. The witch was gone, consumed by her own dark magic, and the forest now seemed to pulse with the remnants of her unnatural power. Ruslan took a deep breath and steeled himself, determined to find Christina and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. As he ventured deeper into the night, the shadows around him seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be uncovered and dangers yet to be faced. He couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Ruslan stumbled through the forest, each step heavier than the last. The once familiar surroundings now seemed alien, twisted by the malevolent energy that had consumed Alina. The trees loomed like specters, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Strange lights flickered in the corners of his vision, and the whispers that had haunted him earlier grew louder, more insistent. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of the inexplicable phenomena unfolding around him. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and shadows danced in ways that defied logic. Ruslan's mind swirled with fear and confusion. The rational world he had known seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a nightmarish landscape where nothing made sense. Every step felt like a struggle against an invisible force. His heart pounded in his chest, and his thoughts raced uncontrollably. He could still hear the echoes of Alina's screams, mixed with the haunting cries of the birds that had attacked her. The images of her twisted face and the dark vortex haunted him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. In his panic, Ruslan tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he barely noticed. The forest seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing down like a physical weight. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling as he stumbled forward once more. Desperation drove him deeper into the woods, away from the horrors he had witnessed. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down his spine. They spoke of ancient curses and forgotten sins, of spirits seeking vengeance and souls lost to madness. Ruslan's mind struggled to hold on to reality. He began to question his sanity, wondering if any of this was real or if he had been trapped in some sort of waking nightmare. The boundaries between the physical world and the supernatural seemed to blur, and he felt himself teetering on the edge of a precipice, ready to plunge into the abyss. His thoughts grew increasingly fragmented. Memories of Christina mingled with the terrifying scenes he had witnessed. Her face appeared in the fog, pleading for help, but then morphed into a grotesque mask of suffering. Ruslan clutched his head, trying to block out the visions, but they only grew stronger, more vivid. The forest itself seemed to come alive with malevolent intent. Branches twisted into grotesque shapes, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift and writhe. Ruslan's footsteps faltered as he felt the very earth pulling at him, trying to drag him down into its dark depths. In a final burst of desperate energy, he broke into a run, his legs pumping frantically as he tore through the underbrush. He didn't care about the cuts and bruises forming on his skin. All that mattered was escape. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring as tears of fear and frustration filled his eyes. But no matter how fast he ran, the whispers followed, echoing in his mind and filling him with a growing sense of dread. The forest seemed endless, a maze of twisted paths and unseen dangers. Every turn brought new horrors, and Ruslan felt himself sinking deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As he stumbled through the darkness, his mind spiraled further into chaos. The world around him became a surreal blend of terror and confusion, where reality and illusion intertwined in a maddening dance. Ruslan knew he was losing his grip on sanity, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. The forest had claimed him, and he was trapped in its grasp, a prisoner of his own fear and the dark magic that had ensnared him. Ruslan's breath was still ragged from his desperate run through the forest. The memories of Alina and the bizarre, supernatural events he had witnessed plagued his mind. He knew he had to pull himself together if he wanted to survive and find his missing sister, Christina. As he regained his composure, he realized he needed a plan. In the midst of his frantic thoughts, he remembered the old barn he had seen earlier. It had a peculiar aura, as if it were hiding something significant. Ruslan decided to head there, hoping it might offer some clues or at least a temporary refuge. His muscles ached and his wounds stung, but he pushed on, driven by the need to save Christina. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered wood and rusty hinges giving it a foreboding appearance. Ruslan approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. The whispers of the forest had subsided, but an eerie silence had taken their place. He walked around the barn, searching for an entrance, but the doors were securely locked, and the windows were boarded up. Frustration gnawed at him until he remembered his dream. In it, there had been a hole in the roof of a structure much like this one. Perhaps the dream had been a premonition. Desperate for any lead, Ruslan decided to climb onto the roof and investigate. He found a sturdy ladder propped against the side of the barn and began his ascent. The climb was arduous, his limbs protesting with each movement. Finally, he hoisted himself onto the roof, which creaked under his weight. Carefully, he crawled towards the center, scanning for the hole from his dream. His heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and fear. There was a gaping hole, just as he had envisioned. Ruslan peered into the darkness below, trying to make out any details. He saw a few beams crossing the space beneath the roof, but their stability was uncertain. The barn's interior was dimly lit by slivers of moonlight piercing through the cracks in the walls. Ruslan knew he had to test the beams before attempting to descend. He pulled on one, feeling it give slightly but holding firm. He tried another, which seemed more solid. Taking a deep breath, he decided to trust his instincts and began his descent, gripping the beams tightly and lowering himself into the barn. As he descended, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over him. He reached the bottom and took a moment to steady himself. The barn's interior was cluttered with old farming equipment and bales of hay, casting long, eerie shadows. Ruslan's flashlight flickered as he scanned the area, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He moved cautiously, every creak and rustle heightening his anxiety. The barn seemed to close in around him, the darkness oppressive. Ruslan forced himself to stay focused, reminding himself of his mission. He had to find Christina, no matter what. Suddenly, he noticed something glinting in the corner of the barn. Approaching it, he saw a small trapdoor set into the floor, partially obscured by hay. His pulse quickened as he realized this could be a hidden entrance to another part of the barn, or perhaps a cellar. He knelt and brushed away the debris, revealing a sturdy latch. Ruslan hesitated for a moment, gathering his courage, then lifted the trapdoor. The hinges squealed in protest, but the door opened, revealing a set of narrow, winding stairs leading down into darkness. A faint, musty odor wafted up, and he could hear the distant sound of dripping water. With a final glance at the barn's interior, Ruslan steeled himself and began his descent into the unknown, his mind racing with thoughts of Christina and the strange, perilous journey he had undertaken. Inside the barn, Ruslan's breath hitched as he surveyed the interior. The high pillars and sacks of flour, dust swirling in the shafts of moonlight, mirrored the haunting vision from his dreams. The barn was eerily quiet, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the oppressive silence. His flashlight flickered weakly, casting elongated shadows that danced menacingly around him. As he moved deeper into the barn, a growing sense of dread settled in his stomach. His gaze landed on a dark stain on the floor. With trembling hands, he crouched down to inspect it, his heart pounding in his chest. The stain was unmistakably blood, and next to it, a clump of light-colored hair glistened in the dim light. A chill ran down his spine as he realized these could be traces of his sister. The scene before him painted a horrific picture. He imagined the terror and pain Christina must have endured, and his heart clenched with anguish. The barn, once a possible refuge, now felt like a tomb filled with echoes of suffering. He touched the hair gently, hoping against hope it wasn't hers, but deep down, he feared the worst. Despair and rage surged through him, a volatile mix that made his vision blur with tears. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, as a scream of frustration and pain built in his throat. Someone had harmed his sister, had turned her life into a nightmare, and he was helpless to have stopped it. The weight of the realization crushed him, but it also ignited a fire within. He rose to his feet, determination hardening his features. He would find those responsible. They would pay for what they had done. Every step he took forward was a vow for vengeance. The image of Christina, innocent and trusting, spurred him on. Ruslan knew he had to be smart, to think clearly despite the swirling emotions threatening to consume him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. The barn had to hold more clues, more pieces of the puzzle that would lead him to the perpetrators. He wiped his tears away, his face now a mask of cold resolve. As he searched, he noticed faint tracks in the dust, leading towards a back door. He followed them, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of the silence that enveloped the barn. The tracks led him outside, where the night air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant hoot of an owl. Outside the barn, Ruslan paused, letting the cool air clear his mind. He had a mission now, a purpose that fueled his every movement. He would uncover the truth, no matter how horrific, and he would bring justice to those who had wronged his sister. The night was dark, but his resolve shone brightly, a beacon guiding him through the encroaching shadows of despair and rage. Ruslan stepped out of the barn, his resolve firm despite the chilling fear gnawing at him. The night was dark, the silence oppressive. As he moved forward, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first glance, she looked like an ordinary woman, but an unsettling aura of malevolence surrounded her, making his skin crawl. The woman stood silently, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. Ruslan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a cautious step back. He could feel the dark energy emanating from her, a palpable force that threatened to crush his spirit. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension, each second stretching into an eternity. "Who are you?" Ruslan demanded, his voice barely masking his fear. He needed answers, needed to know if this woman held the key to his sister's fate. But the more he looked at her, the more familiar she seemed, stirring long-buried memories. The woman tilted her head, a cold smile playing on her lips. "You don't recognize me," Ruslan. Her voice was both haunting and strangely comforting, a juxtaposition that made his blood run cold. He frowned, trying to place her face. As he scrutinized her features, a horrifying realization began to dawn. Her eyes, though now filled with an unearthly glow, were the same eyes he had looked into countless times as a child. His breath caught in his throat, and his mind raced to comprehend the impossible. "Mother," he whispered, his voice breaking. The word hung in the air, heavy with disbelief and horror. She nodded slowly, her smile widening. "Yes, Ruslan, it's me." Ruslan staggered back, his world tilting on its axis. The woman standing before him, the source of his terror and confusion, was his own mother. The realization was a hammer blow to his chest, knocking the wind out of him. How could she be here, transformed into this malevolent being? He remembered the warmth and kindness of his mother, the gentle hands that had comforted him as a child. But now, those same hands were twisted with a dark power, and the eyes that once looked at him with love were filled with an eerie light. "Why?" he choked out, tears blurring his vision. "Why did you do this?" She sighed, the sound tinged with a mix of regret and resolve. "I had no choice, Ruslan. The power consumed me, changed me. But I never stopped loving you or Christina." The mention of his sister's name reignited the fire within him. "What happened to Christina?" he demanded, stepping forward despite his trembling legs. "Where is she?" His mother looked away, her expression pained. She got caught in the web of darkness that ensnared me. I tried to protect her, but I failed." Rage and sorrow surged through Ruslan, warring for dominance. He clenched his fists, struggling to contain the torrent of emotions. "You have to help me find her. You owe me that much." She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I will help you, Ruslan. But know this: the path ahead is fraught with danger. The darkness is strong, and it will not let us go easily." Ruslan steeled himself, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. He had come too far to turn back now. With his mother by his side, he would uncover the truth and avenge his sister. The night was filled with unseen terrors, but his determination burned brighter than ever, guiding him through the shadows. As Ruslan stepped into the house, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The shadows seemed to cling to him, whispering sinister secrets. He moved cautiously through the dimly lit rooms, his heart pounding in his chest. He sensed that something unspeakable lay ahead, something that would shatter his very soul. In the corner of a small, cluttered room, he saw a wicker basket covered in downy feathers. The sight was jarring, an incongruous touch of domesticity in a place that reeked of death. As he approached, the coppery smell of blood became overwhelming. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid of the basket, revealing a sight that made his stomach churn and his vision blur with tears. Inside the basket lay the mutilated remains of his sister, Christina. Her once beautiful face was a mask of agony, her body broken and torn apart. Feathers clung to her lifeless form, a grotesque parody of peace. Ruslan fell to his knees, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He had found her, but the reality was far worse than anything he had imagined. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the horror before him. The image of the witch, his mother, flashed in his mind. Had he been so blinded by his desperation and rage that he had mistaken Christina for the witch? The thought was unbearable, a devastating blow to his already fragile sanity. Ruslan stumbled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to find out the truth. He needed answers, and he would get them, no matter the cost. He moved through the house, his movements frantic and disjointed. Every shadow seemed to mock him, every creak of the floorboards a sinister laugh. As he reached the main hall, he saw his mother standing there, her face a mask of sorrow and guilt. "You were supposed to protect her," Ruslan spat, his voice shaking with anger and grief. "I tried, Ruslan," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The darkness. It consumed everything. I couldn't save her." "Why did you do it?" he demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why did you bring this horror upon us?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I didn't bring it. It was always here, lurking in the shadows. I tried to keep it at bay, but it was too strong." Ruslan's rage bubbled over, and he slammed his fist into the wall. "You could have done something, anything. Instead, you let it take her." His mother collapsed to her knees, her sobs racking her body. "I'm so sorry, Ruslan. I failed you both." He turned away from her, his mind a maelstrom of fury and despair. He had to make things right. He had to find a way to end the nightmare that had engulfed his family. But first, he needed to know the full extent of the dark secrets that had been hidden from him. He searched the house, uncovering fragments of the truth piece by piece. Old journals, cryptic notes, and eerie drawings painted a picture of a family cursed by dark forces, manipulated and twisted by malevolent spirits. The witch, his mother, had tried to fight back, but in doing so, had only brought more suffering upon them all. As the night wore on, Ruslan's resolve hardened. He would find a way to break the curse, to avenge Christina's death, and to put an end to the darkness that had claimed his family. The path ahead was shrouded in shadows, but he would face it head-on, driven by a burning desire for justice and retribution. In the dead of night, with the echoes of his sister's cries still haunting his mind, Ruslan prepared himself for the final confrontation. He would uncover the full truth, no matter how horrifying, and he would ensure that those responsible paid for their sins. The darkness had taken too much from him already. It was time for him to take something back. Realization hit Ruslan like a physical blow. His sister Christina was dead, her lifeless body a testament to the horrors that had unfolded in this cursed place. The revelation that his own mother was at the heart of these dark forces left him reeling with a mix of grief, betrayal, and despair. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls whispering secrets of the ancient malevolence that had claimed his family. In the suffocating silence, a low growl reverberated through the room, sending a shiver down Ruslan's spine. He turned to see the witch, his mother, standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Beside her, a monstrous black hound, its eyes burning with hellfire, bared its teeth. The demonic presence emanated a palpable aura of hatred and death. "Why?" Mother Ruslan's voice trembled, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and rage. "Why did you let this happen?" The witch's face twisted into a sorrowful grimace. "I tried to protect you, Ruslan, but the darkness was too strong. It consumed everything." The hound's growl deepened, and it took a step forward, its claws scraping against the wooden floor. Ruslan knew he had to act quickly. Grabbing a broken chair leg, he held it out defensively, his eyes darting between the demonic dog and his mother. "Enough," he shouted, trying to muster the last remnants of his courage. "I won't let you take me too." His mother raised her hand, murmuring incantations under her breath. The air crackled with dark energy, and the room seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Ruslan felt a cold, clammy hand of fear grip his heart. The hound lunged, its jaws snapping dangerously close to his throat. Ruslan swung the chair leg with all his might, hitting the beast on the side. The hound yelped but quickly recovered, its eyes burning with renewed fury. As the struggle continued, Ruslan realized he was fighting not just for his life, but for his very soul. The witch's chanting grew louder, the dark power building in the room. Shadows danced on the walls, and an unnatural wind whipped around them, howling like the lost souls trapped in this forsaken place. Ruslan knew he was outmatched. The witch's power was too great, and the demonic hound was relentless. Each attack from the beast sapped his strength, and each incantation from his mother drained his will to fight. Despair threatened to overwhelm him, but a flicker of determination kept him going. He couldn't give up. Not now. In a final, desperate act, Ruslan lunged at the witch, hoping to break her concentration. His mother stumbled backward, momentarily losing control of the dark forces she had summoned. The hound paused, its fiery eyes flickering with uncertainty. But the respite was brief. The witch regained her composure and unleashed a torrent of dark energy that sent Ruslan crashing to the floor. Pain coursed through his body, and he struggled to rise. The demonic hound advanced, its jaws dripping with anticipation. Ruslan looked into his mother's eyes, seeing a mixture of sorrow and resolve. She was lost to him, consumed by the darkness she had sought to control. As the hound leaped, Ruslan closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. In that final moment, a chilling realization settled over him. He wasn't just fighting against his mother or the hound. He was fighting against an ancient evil that had claimed his family for generations. And now, it would claim him too. The last thing he heard was his mother's voice, a mournful whisper lost in the cacophony of the dark storm. "Forgive me, Ruslan, then. There was only darkness." In the end, Ruslan was alone, his fate sealed by the very forces he had sought to escape. The darkness closed in, and the house fell silent once more, a monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. His story ended not with a triumphant escape, but with a somber reminder of the power of the dark forces that had consumed his family